Begin by thanking Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Cantor and their staff for prioritizing House consideration of this important reauthorization, as well as House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce and Congressman Chris Smith for shepherding this legislation through the committee process. I will say publicly what I've said many times privately. No person that I have served with in 34 years has done more for human rights and religious freedom than Congressman Chris Smith. He is my hero. When I look and see the giants that I have served with in the 34 years, and when you go abroad, whether it be in Boko Haram territory in Nigeria or whether it be in China, wherever, no one has a greater reputation for speaking out for the voiceless than Congressman Smith. So I appreciate Chris's efforts of moving this thing quickly. I also want to thank Elise Anderson from my staff, who has done incredible work on this. From the start, this bill has enjoyed, as Mr. Smith said, strong bipartisan support, including the co-sponsorship of Foreign Affairs Committee Ranking Member Eliot Engel. And I want to thank Mr. Engel for his support and also his strong support on these issues over the years. The broad support for this bill is fitting for an issue so central to America's own grand experiment in self-governance, the protection of religious freedom, which is often referred to as America's first freedom. Sadly, one need only pick up the newspaper today to see how religious freedom is under assault globally. The terrorist Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, is gaining territory in Iraq and before our eyes is threatening the very existence of ancient faith communities in the region, including the centuries-old Christian communities. Tens of thousands of Iraqi Christians have fled Mosul and the surrounding region of what the Christian Science Monitor recently characterized as a cataclysmic restructuring of an area that was home to some of the earliest Christians, end of quote. In addition to the crisis in Iraq, religious minorities are marginalized and imperiled in Egypt and in Syria. The government of Vietnam severely restricts religious activities of all faiths, as does the government of China. And religious minorities, such as the Ahmadi Muslims, face governmental and social harassment in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. Countries that we give aid and support through the Ahmadis in Pakistan cannot even vote. These persecuted individuals and communities look to the U.S. above all others to champion their cause and to raise their plate with repressive governments. In May, I introduced H.R. 4653, the bipartisan legislation before us today, which reauthorizes the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 5 years. First created in 1998 through the International Religious Freedom Act, it is an independent, bipartisan federal governmental commission that monitors the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad, reviews the facts and circumstances of religious freedom violations based on international standards, and makes policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. Without this commission, there would be no one around to point out what is taking place to these groups. Since its inception, the commission has been an invaluable watchdog for global religious freedom and conditions. The commission has been a voice for the imprisoned Baha'i leader languishing unjustly behind the bars in Iran. And many Baha'is are behind the bars in Iran, and if it wasn't for the commission, no one would know. The commission has been a voice of the fearful Iraqi nun, uncertain if there is a future for her in the land of her birth. And more biblical activity took place in Iraq than any other country of the world other than Israel. Abraham's from Iraq. Ezekiel's buried in Iraq, Daniel's from Iraq, Jonah and Nineveh, and yet without the commission there will be nobody speaking out for the Iraqi nun who's fearful of her life and fearful of the future for her church. The commission has been the voice of the Buddhist monk who has watched with horror as more than 130 of his fellow Tibetans have set themselves aflame in desperation at the abuses they've suffered at the hands of the Chinese government. If it was not for this commission, nobody would know how the Buddhists are being persecuted in Tibet. In short, the commission has been, and with passage of this legislation will continue to be, the voice of the marginalized, oppressed, and persecuted people who dare to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. The commission can be relied upon to consistently give the unvarnished truth, as Mr. Smith said, about the true state of religious freedom in countries around the globe, whether they are strategic allies or adversaries. The Commission is unhindered by the bureaucratic morass that so often stymies the State Department during both Republican and Democratic administrations alike. Given the state of religious freedom abroad today, the sobering reality is that the Commission's voice is needed more now than ever before. A vote for this legislation is a vote for America's first freedom. And with that, I urge unanimous passage of this and yield back the balance of my time.